Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady coming to you from New York City. Now, I'm still away at the moment, but I thought in the meantime, what we do is do something a little fun. See, we've made a few videos on this channel. I think the read at the moment is something like 280 to 300 or something ridiculous like that. That's a lot of ship stories, and it's kind of easy for a lot of that stuff to get buried because there's just so many stories that we've told, and I've got a few favorites of mine that I just haven't really been able to highlight since we made the video. So I thought what we'd do today is make a little compilation of some of my favorite ship stories that we've ever told in short on this channel. So sit back and relax and enjoy some of my favorite ship stories. In April 2022, the Russian guided missile cruiser Moskva was destroyed by the Ukrainian military. The ship had been commissioned in 1983 and had been thoroughly modernized through the years for the equivalent cost of millions of dollars. Its loss was an embarrassment for the Russian Navy because Moskva was actually the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. But it may surprise you to know that the ship actually sent back to the wreck to tend to it and recover lost items was built way back in 1913. The Russian salvage ship Kommuna is an absolutely fascinating thing. Over 110 years old now and still in service, this makes her easily the oldest active duty Navy vessel in service in the world. Her story is as unorthodox and bizarre as the design of the ship itself. So how exactly does a ship end up serving its country for over 100 years? Well, it's actually a fairly rare occurrence. Most major navies' warships today can be up to 30 or 40 years old, but that's around the time when faults begin to appear. The cost of maintaining a ship beyond 30 or 40 years can begin to mount as critical machinery needs more care and fatigue from decades of sailing on the ocean begins to show. Kommuna is a special case. The US Navy's oldest active duty ship by comparison is the 54-year-old amphibious command ship USS Blue Ridge from 1970. Kommuna is almost 60 years older than that. How she's managed to avoid the scrapyard is an interesting tale, and it all begins back in the early 1900s.
That is Russia.
The Imperial Russian Navy was preparing for war back then, and famously, it wouldn't actually go so well for them. But at the time, they were investing in new and exciting technologies, and one of those was the submarine. With a fledgling submarine fleet, the Navy realised it would need to provide support to their new boats, and a dedicated tender or support vessel was needed. Now this is where Kommuna comes in. Back then, the ship was called Volkov, and she was built at the Pudilov shipyard at St. Petersburg, Russia, ordered less than a month after Titanic had sunk in the North Atlantic. In 1915, the ship was officially commissioned into the Russian Navy as a submarine support vessel. Now, having such a dedicated task, Volkov had a few obvious design peculiarities. Obviously, she wasn't too good looking, although I do guess beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The ship is a twin-hull vessel, or a catamaran. The idea behind the weird shape of the hull was that the ship could sit comfortably over the top of the submarine and restock torpedoes or fuel from above, but that wasn't all. Volkov was also a submarine salvage ship, so if a Russian submarine was sunk, Volkov could anchor above the wreck and use a very heavy-duty lifting winch and crane to pluck the wreck from the sea floor from between its two hulls. Now, the Russians had seen the concept tested earlier on the German salvage ship SMS Vulcan in 1908, and they were evidently impressed. So Volkov improved on the German ship by adding a bigger and more impressive lifting rig, a type of gantry crane. In 1917 alone, the ship salvaged 2 Russian submarines. So that year, 1917, Volkov found itself serving against its own countrymen in the Russian Civil War, and then shortly afterwards, with the victory and ascension to power of the Soviets, she found herself under new management. The ship was renamed Kommuna, the name she still carries to this day, and she undertook a lot of salvage missions. One of the most interesting of those early years involved the retrieval of the British submarine L-55, which was sunk with all hands in 1919. Years later, in 1928, she was raised by Kommuna, and the remains of her crew returned to Great Britain, but incredibly, the rusted-out, muddy wreck was rebuilt and put into service by the Soviets, even though it had been sitting on the sea floor for nearly a decade. The sub would go on to be tested by the Soviets, serving as the basis for a new class of Russian submarine, and it was only scrapped in the 1950s or 60s. Now clearly Kommuna was of huge use to the Russians. Whenever something needed picking up from the seabed, Kommuna was called out to do it. Aircraft wrecks, tugboats, it didn't matter. If it was within her weight capacity, Kommuna could raise them up. In World War II, Kommuna's fortune was badly tested. By all rights, the ship probably shouldn't have survived. Bombed by German aircraft, she was damaged, but continued to serve. Her most interesting mission in that war happened in March 1942. Dozens of critical vehicles for the war effort, as well as heavy machinery, had actually fallen through an ice road and sunk. Kommuna got to work and pulled out no fewer than 4 massive KV tanks and 33 other vehicles like trucks, tankers, and tractors that had plunged through. In the year 1944 alone, Kommuna had recovered some 11,800 tons of shipping and repaired over 30 ships. By the end of the war, Kommuna was 32 years old, and probably nearing the end of her life. Or at least you'd think so, but clearly the Soviets had other ideas. All through the 50s and 60s, and the 70s, Kommuna was doing her thing with her usual aplomb. In 1954, she'd actually gone in for a massive refit in the Netherlands, and the months-long work saw the old workhorse re-engined, her ancient reciprocating steam engines being replaced with modern diesels. Incredibly, this gave the specialist ship a fresh bill of health and a new lease on life. This basically set the pattern for Kommuna for the next few decades. The whole time, the ship was running important missions for the Russian Navy, rescuing crews trapped in wrecks, recovering lost aircraft or submarines. In 1984, the ship was finally removed from Navy service to be transferred to the Russian Academy of Sciences, but during a period of inactivity, she was looted. Dodging the scrapyard yet again, the Russian government refitted her completely. The transfer was cancelled, and Kommuna was back with the Navy for the turn of the millennium. So it was that by 2022, some 110 years after she was first introduced, Kommuna was out again over the wreck of the cruiser Moskva. Now, a warship that big stands no chance of being pulled up by a rescue vessel like Kommuna, but it's probable that the old ship was actually recovering important and classified documents, equipment, and even crew remains. In this way, the world was treated to the bizarre sight of the Kommuna of 1913 recovering things from the wreck of a cruiser from 1983. So why has Kommuna been able to serve for so long? Well, like many other ships that serve way beyond the normal amount of time that a ship should, it's usually down to one of 3 factors. It's either cost and convenience, it's either designed for a very specialist task, therefore difficult to replace, or it's just good old-fashioned good luck. Specialist vessels tend to stay in service for long periods of time because they're so unique and expensive to reproduce that if they're doing a good enough job and the design is sound, then there's simply no need to retire or replace them. One good example is the deep-sea diving submersible Alvin, which famously was used to explore the wreck of the Titanic. This incredible little sub will turn 60 this year, and it is happily still in service. Another example is the US Iowa class of battleships. Now, these are decommissioned now, but they were in service from the 1940s and recommissioned briefly for a stint in the 1990s for Operation Desert Storm. World War II rendered battleships nearly useless thanks to advances in aircraft technology, but the Iowa class, with their insanely powerful guns, could serve as very capable offshore artillery platforms for bombarding enemies far inland from the sea. And so it was under these very specific operating requirements that the Iowas were recommissioned and sent to the Middle East. Interestingly, a US federal law dictated that at least 2 Iowa-class battleships should be included in the Naval Register because their use as a floating artillery platform was so unique that no modern-day cruiser, frigate, or missile-armed warship could do it as well. She was finally decommissioned in 2006, over 60 years after she had been built. In more modern times, it's been announced that the Arleigh Burke class of destroyers of the US Navy will actually be modernised and pressed into service possibly for another 40 years. When they are finally retired, sometime in the 2060s or 70s, they'll be around 80 years old. In the sky, the same is true of the B-52 bomber. Only 744 of these things were built, just between the years 1952 and 1962, and it's thought that they will still be in service 100 years after they were first introduced. So some ships do sneak through the cracks and do a job so well that they just don't need to be retired or replaced. One day, of course, Kommuna will need to be decommissioned, and that day is probably looming soon. But so long as her steel plates stay watertight and her engines keep her chugging along, it seems that the Russian Navy isn't in too much of a rush to put this maritime supercentenarian to bed just yet. 3 US Air Force bombers are roaring through the skies, searching for their target. They're looking for a celebrated vessel, and it's paramount to their country that they find it. Rain squalls obscure visibility, but then, like an apparition, the ship appears. The bombers line up on their target, but then they fly past, and the crews simply wave. The radio man establishes contact with the ship, and its captain invites the air crews to lunch on board. This strange interaction didn't happen in wartime. It happened in 1938, a year before the Second World War erupted and plunged the globe into chaos. The target ship was the SS Rex, a luxury Italian liner, winner of the Blue Riband for the fastest Atlantic crossing and the toast of European shipbuilding. She was a playground for the rich and famous. But a few short years later, in 1944, the SS Rex would become an actual target of war, be hunted down and mercilessly destroyed. SS Rex was an absolute technological marvel when she first debuted in 1931. She was the result of a strong push by the Italian merchant marine and government to establish the nation as a serious player on the transatlantic routes to America. See, back then, this service from Europe to the US was extremely profitable, and hundreds of thousands took the trip each week. But it was also a showcase of national strength and achievement. Ocean liners became a symbol of their home nation's strength. They were owned by private companies which built and operated them, but they were also heavily subsidized and paid for by the government to serve as a floating billboard for that nation. For years, Britain and Germany had dominated the headlines. Aside from the occasional American interjection, those nations had always had the biggest and fastest ocean liners, and Italy set out to change that. It was the Italian line that rose to the challenge with government backing and ordered the construction of 2 impressive ships, Rex and the Conte de Savoie. At 885 feet or 270 metres long and around 55,000 gross registered tons, they couldn't take the title for the largest ships in the world, although they were extremely impressive. Where they would shine was in their luxury and especially in their speed. The ships used all the modern technology, powerful steam turbines driving 4 propellers, a bulbous bow to reduce drag through the water, and fine hull lines to maximise the effect. The result was a pair of very fast ships, and Rex was the fastest. She set to sea in 1931, and at first failed to capture the prize for the fastest ship on the Atlantic run, but then, in 1933, she did it, breaking the record and winning Italian line the coveted Blue Riband for the first time in history. Rex was fast, sure, but she was also absolutely gorgeous inside. Passengers adored her rich and luxurious interiors. The designers knew exactly what they were doing. The ship had been dubbed the Riviera afloat. To capitalise on this, her outdoor swimming pools even had sand and colourful umbrellas. Thousands travelled on Rex in comfort and style, but around her, and for the world at large, things were changing in a big way. The halcyon days of carefree sailings at sea were about to end, because there was a war coming. Now, I know that this is a ship-focused channel, but we have to talk about aeroplanes for a minute. For years after the First World War, an uneasy peace had remained. Germany and its allies had been defeated, sure, but then a shock political reversal happened and the Nazis came to power. They secretly funneled money into military projects. So did the Japanese government. Across the world, nations were entering into an arms race at the same time that wild, untested new technology began to be introduced all the time. And one of these was the airplane. Sure, it had proved its worth as a military platform in the First World War, serving in fighter and bomber roles, but its capabilities at sea were never properly tested. By the 1930s, airplanes were very different to how they'd looked during the First World War. They weren't wood and canvas anymore. Bombers were almost all metal, with 2 or 3 or 4 powerful engines and massive payloads of bombs. It might seem crazy to us now, but none of that technology had been tested or adequately deployed in combat. The 1930s would teach the world's nations a lot of important lessons, and at the heart of one of these lessons would be the SS Rex. You might be surprised to learn that the US Air Force, as we know it today, was not initially intended to be its own independent branch of the military. Between the years 1920 and 1941, the United States Army Air Corps simply existed as an aerial branch of the US Army, at a time before aviation was considered, by itself, a crucial aspect of warfare. But there were some that felt, even early on, that the Air Corps would become a fixture of modern combat and deserve its own branch of the military. The Navy was particularly unimpressed. They thought the Air Corps should stay out of maritime business, and aircraft would have little impact attacking ships. There were a lot of debates about this, and one man set out on a mission to prove the naysayers wrong. In 1921, the flamboyant fighter pilot Brigadier General Billy Mitchell sought to make this into a reality, planning out several aerial bombing exercises to display the capabilities of the airborne fleet in a wartime setting. Mitchell reasoned that the Navy was wasting its time and money building dreadnought-style battleships, and that many bomber aircraft could be built for the price of a single battleship, and then easily sink that same ship. Mitchell went directly against the Navy, using his fleet of bombers to sink decommissioned battleships in tests that demonstrated their superiority over their maritime counterparts. This didn't make him any friends. The Navy was incensed because the tests cut the Navy out and flew in the face of terms of engagement which limited the size of bombs that were even able to be used. The president himself, Harding, was furious because Mitchell's tests made the Navy look bad at a politically delicate time. Things got so hostile that Mitchell's temporary rank of Brigadier General was not renewed, and he was bumped back down to the permanent rank of Colonel because of his insubordination. In the end, Mitchell would go on to make a name for himself as a free thinker, accusing senior Army and Navy figures of treasonous disregard for safety in the crash of the US airship Shenandoah. He was court-martialed for this and resigned in 1926, although he would continue to preach about the power of aircraft for years to come. Missing their biggest advocate, the Air Corps pressed on with their tests and demonstrations, but then they hit a serious snag. In 1931, they attempted a test sinking of the old World War I cargo ship, the USS Mount Shasta, but then, in front of news cameramen, military officials, and reporters, the Mount Shasta could not be located by the bombers. 3 days later, another attack was launched, but the aircraft only scored a few hits, and the Mount Shasta didn't sink. It was a PR disaster. The Navy publicly mocked the effort, and the Air Corps was deeply embarrassed. The Air Corps went back to the drawing board. They needed the chance to show the world that bombers could reliably track down and engage fast-moving enemy ships. Years later, they would get their chance. Without Navy input, they would intercept one of the world's fastest ships as she approached the US. The target was the SS Rex. In May 1938, Rex departed from her home port of Genova, Italy, for the regular express service to New York City with hundreds on board. It was spring, and the Atlantic still had a chill, but the days at sea were happy and relaxed. But a few hundred miles across the ocean, on the US East Coast, preparations were being made. Rex would be given a warm reception by the United States Air Corps. See, under the command of Major General Frank M. Andrews, 187 combat planes and over 2,000 airmen were called up to participate in a monumental military exercise to once and for all convince the nation of the might of the Air Corps and its legitimacy as an independent military body. Stationed at 19 different airfields throughout the Northeast were a variety of combat aircraft meant to take place in these exercises, but the real spectacle was the brand shiny new Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. These monstrous 4-engine, long-range heavy bombers were the pride of the Air Corps, and though they were still in their testing phases at the time, the Army had high hopes for these aircraft. Not only would the exercise illustrate the strength of the Air Corps as an independent entity, but it would be fantastic to put these powerful new planes through their paces. The point of the exercise was to simulate the defense of New England by the B-17 force against an attacking aircraft carrier fleet. However, since no vessels were supplied to play the role of enemy forces, one was needed to be selected. Lieutenant Harris Hull, a reporter for the Washington Post who was a reservist on temporary duty at the time, suggested the possibility of using an ocean liner as a target, flying far out to sea to intercept the ship at a distance far beyond what had ever been attempted before. The goal, of course, was not to damage or sink the ship, simply to fly in low, hovering just above at smokestack level, demonstrating that the bombers were capable of tracking ships even when they were far out to sea. There was, he learned, an ocean liner steaming roughly 1,000 nautical miles offshore, headed into New York. Hull reasoned that this would present the perfect opportunity to flex the muscles of the brand new bombers for all the world to see. The exercise was meant to be a field day for the press, not just from the ground either. A radio crew from the National Broadcasting Company would be broadcasting the feat from aboard the lead aircraft. Major General W. Goddard would fly co-pilot with a special camera to photograph the exact moment the planes roared over the vessel. Taking off from Mitchell Field at 8:45 a.m. on May 12, 1938, the three B-17 bombers set out on a course for the SS Rex. Initially, they were met with horrific weather, which made the task of searching for the liner almost impossible. If the rain, hail, and downdrafts weren't bad enough, headwinds pushed back against the bombers, slowing their speed by 11.5 miles per hour. Turbulence threw the planes around in the air, causing air sickness for the hapless NBC crew on board. The time was approaching for the live broadcast to begin, but with the wreck still nowhere in sight and the weather refusing to cooperate, the aircrew began to get nervous. They'd given themselves some margin for error when plotting their course, but with setbacks due to the weather, they now only had time for one shot. They no longer had the luxury of time to attempt to circle the vessel. Their approach had to be dead on, and the ship needed to be visible. And even worse, an expected position report on Rex never arrived. The crew realized that if the weather didn't clear up quickly, the whole mission would need to be aborted. They'd been in the air already for nearly 4 hours. The very real possibility of another thwarted attempt began to set in. Embarrassment seemed near, and suddenly, the planes broke through the clouds into clear skies, and then incredibly, right below them, there was the SS Rex. They had done it. The aircrew exploded with cries of "There she is! There she is!" and the three bombers descended and shot past Rex at smokestack level, while hundreds of passengers crowded on deck to marvel at the spectacle. Some Americans on board even began singing the Star-Spangled Banner as the planes flew overhead. The ship's captain made contact with the aircrew over the radio, exchanging pleasantries, and then inviting all members down to come for lunch. The intercept was broadcast live by NBC on a coast-to-coast hookup, and Goddard's photograph of the three B-17s hovering weightlessly above the proud ocean liner would be found on the front pages of newspapers across the country. SS Rex was again front page news. The Navy was, of course, less than thrilled by this stunt. Top Navy brass insisted that the exercise, quote, was in violation of the Navy's prerogative of controlling the sea approaches, and as a result, an attempt was made to prevent all Air Corps aircraft from operating beyond a 100-mile line from the US coast. Now, this order was seen as flimsy at best. It was only intermittently enforced. There are in fact reports that this order was never even put into writing because no Air Corps officer ever laid eyes on an official copy. In fact, just a month after the SS Rex was intercepted, the Air Corps successfully carried out another similar interception of the ocean liner the Queen of Bermuda, some 300 nautical miles offshore, with no apparent infraction. Though the Navy protested, the Air Corps had made their point, and there was no more denying the capabilities of these powerful B-17 bombers and aerial combat as a whole. As we now know, the Air Force would later become its own independent military branch, owing in part to the spectacle of the interception of the SS Rex. But sadly, Billy Mitchell, the maverick pilot who had championed the aircraft so much, did not get to see the triumph. He died in 1936 of a heart attack, aged just 56. Of course, Mitchell would go on to be proved totally right. Battleships and large warships were incredibly vulnerable to air attack. Dozens of prized warships were lost in the Second World War from all nations. Ships that represented national pride, the Prince of Wales, the Bismarck, the Yamato, all of them were badly damaged or sunk by aircraft with almost no recourse. And another ship hunted down was the SS Rex. In 1938, she had been part of the effort to prove that aircraft in wartime could be devastating to an enemy fleet, and then, in the Second World War, she went through the real thing. Rex and Comte de Savoie were taken off civilian service in 1940 and mothballed for years, and then 4 years later in 1944, Rex's day of destiny finally arrived. She was spotted from the air, and 2 waves of 24 Bristol Beaufighter aircraft attacked. They hit the ship with dozens of rockets and shells until finally, scorched and smouldering, she rolled over and came to rest in the shallow harbour. It was a sad end to a glorious ship, and she was broken up in situ and relegated to the history books. Today, air power controls the sky totally, and ships are very much still at risk of aerial attack. But the sad story of the SS Rex is a curious reminder of a time when technology was unproven, and it took a few dreamers and daredevils to foresee the future and prove the right way forward. It's a bright, sunny day, and sitting tall and proud on the stocks of a slipway is the towering hull of a huge ship ready for launch. This is the RMS Titanic, the newest of the Harland & Wolff shipyard's works in Belfast, and very soon she'll be rumbling down the slipway to float for the very first time. But Titanic was just one in a long and proud line of ships built by this legendary company, and remarkably, most of the work was done by hand. Men drove home red-hot iron rivets into hard steel with huge hammers. They scaled enormous scaffolding that kissed the clouds and overlooked their home city. Craftsmen, artisans, ironworkers, riveters, boilermakers, they all came together to create an army thousands strong to build massive ships all in-house. Harland & Wolff was founded in Belfast in 1861 by Edward James Harland and Gustav Wilhelm Wolff. The shipyard was originally tasked with building ships for the Bibi line, and the ships delivered by the yard sported design innovations that instantly set Harland & Wolff apart from their competition. Gustav Schwab, responsible for helping to partially fund the shipyard, and who also had a sizable investment in the Bibi line, would later join forces with Thomas Ismay to acquire a particular struggling shipping company, the White Star Line. Schwab, seeing the opportunities for a fruitful partnership, made a deal with Ismay that Harland & Wolff would provide White Star Line with new ships to fill out their new fleet, and in return, White Star Line would promise to acquire their future ships only from Harland & Wolff. It was with this arrangement that the wheels of fate began to turn, and the stage was now set for the construction of some of the most famous ships the world has ever seen. Fast forward to the second decade of the 1900s, and Harland & Wolff had exploded into one of the world's largest shipping concerns. Located in Belfast, Ireland, it was a vast complex with shops dedicated to just about everything you can imagine that needed making in-house to form, piece by piece, the entirety of a massive ocean liner. There were workshops dedicated just to making portholes by their hundreds. There were fan workshops, paint workshops, engine and boiler room sheds, carpentry shops, and many, many more. Now, this vast industrial town of a shipyard was tasked with the design and construction of the White Star Line's newer superliners, the Olympic class. It would require a massive amount of skilled and manual labour to get the job done right. Now, these just weren't fancy boats for the wealthy, after all. They were a source of national pride, so they had to be built to an exacting standard without a single rivet out of place. Olympic and Titanic were, at the time, the largest man-made objects ever to be built, and their splendour and beauty all pay a testament to the craftsmanship and keen eye for detail that went into every square inch of their massive 45,000-ton structures. Harland & Wolff was well known for supplying White Star Line with the largest and most luxurious, safest liners at sea. It was a partnership, after all, that by 1910 had gone back decades, and it culminated thus far in the previous generation of massive luxury liner known as the Big Four. Olympic and Titanic would be the new golden standard of seafaring, and they would require the utmost in design and workmanship. And here's how they did it. The shipyard was very particular about the men that it hired. They had to keep a rigid set of standards for those they did employ. Some 3,000 men were assigned to build Titanic. That's about 20% of the yard's total workforce. Many of them were as young as 16 when they started at the yard. But how did you even find yourself employed at one of the world's biggest shipbuilding operations in the first place? Well, there were three main ways that a prospective worker could get their foot in the door. Some young men from more well-off families joined the yard as a pupil or premium apprentice. In fact, this is exactly how Lord Edward Peary, the shipyard's chairman by 1912, had started out way back in 1862. After paying a fee of around £100, or what would today be $14,000 or £11,000, the pupil would be taken on as a gentleman apprentice with hopes of rising through the ranks into shipyard management. This apprenticeship would see the pupil learning basically every trade involved in shipbuilding, and if his work was enough to impress the superiors, he would see himself rewarded with a sizable promotion at the end. Titanic's chief architects, Alexander Carlisle and Thomas Andrews, had both worked their way up in Harland and Wolff as apprentices, where they both spent tireless hours mastering their craft in each and every workshop of the shipyard. Andrews actually began his 5-year apprenticeship first at the joiner's shop, where he spent 3 months learning to craft the ship's wooden fixtures. From there, he spent several months with the cabinet makers, refining his skill at creating furniture for the ships, but soon he moved on to other areas. For the first 3.5 years of his apprenticeship, Andrews learned everything from framing and plating to painting and riveting until he finally came to the real challenge: 18 full months spent in the drawing office. The workers in this area, called draftsmen, were responsible for drawing up the ship's plans, amounting to thousands of pages of blueprints detailing the ship's design down to the last detail. In fact, as part of the process, some plans were even marked out in full scale on the empty floor of massive warehouses. Now, this is truly the backbone of any ship's construction, so an apprentice would spend the most amount of time here plotting out every porthole and rivet, and it's for very good reason. The apprenticeship was designed to shape workers into well-rounded shipwrights who would later oversee the construction of ships on their own. And this is exactly what happened in Andrews' case. 20 years after he began his apprenticeship, he found himself as managing director of the yard, overseeing the conception and completion of Olympic and Titanic, alongside Carlisle and Peary. But if your family couldn't afford the fee, or you weren't interested in being promoted to management, there were other options available to get started in the yard. A prospective worker could enter the shipyard as a basic apprentice without needing to pay a fee. These were usually tradesmen intent upon becoming artisans or workers in one specific area of shipbuilding. While they were rarely promoted into upper management roles, they would typically rise through the ranks in the trade of their choosing. The final, and perhaps most dehumanizing method of finding work, would be by means of casual labor. Prospective employees, many of whom were desperate for work of any kind, would assemble outside the yard at around 6 a.m. every day, at which time a foreman would assess the crowd to pick out a crew from amidst the hopeful faces. There were no interviews, tests, or evaluations of any sort. If the foreman liked the look of you, you were hired. It was common for a foreman to choose the same men repeatedly if he knew that they were good workers, but this also meant that many unfortunate men who the foreman didn't fancy would have to return home to their families with no hope of pay. For those that did successfully find employment with Harland and Wolff, the roles they could find themselves in were as varied as the sprawling yard's facilities themselves. Work was primarily divided into 2 separate areas of the yard: the shipyard proper and the engine works. The shipyard was of course concerned with the construction of the ship itself, while the engine works dealt with construction of her boilers, engine and propelling machinery. It took thousands of highly skilled labourers working across various departments to bring a ship like Titanic to life, and the roles were far too many to list here. But among the most iconic jobs a worker could find themselves in at a shipyard would be among the team of riveters, generally composed of 4 men, working in tandem to carefully and precisely drive the ship's rivets into her hull, either by hand or with the help of hydraulic machines. The job was of the utmost importance and required no small amount of skill, as these rivets, about 3 million of them in Titanic's case, literally held the ship together. Riveters were paid per rivet, not per hour, and this meant that many workers exacted schemes to ensure that they would take home a few extra pence at the end of the week. One scheme required the heater boy, responsible for heating the rivets in small furnaces, as the name implies, would sneak into the yard early before work began and light the fire that heated the rivets so that the rest of the team would waste no time getting started and they could eke out a few more rivets by the end of the day. But it's important to note that being paid per piece didn't, surprisingly, encourage the workers to rush or deliver sloppy work. A member of the team called a rivet counter saw to that. Shipyard workers were actually proud of the ships that they built as well, meaning that even with their pay on the line, they generally did their best to make sure their work was of the utmost quality. For Harland and Wolff management, overseeing a workforce of this size was no easy task. And because of this, all workers were supplied with a list of rules they had to adhere to in order to continue with their employment. To start, workers were to arrive ready to work at 6:20 a.m. sharp every day, equipped with their own set of tools, either purchased with their own funds or gifted from a family member or friend, but never provided by the shipyard. Workers could only enter and exit the shipyard through the appropriate gates, otherwise they could be terminated on the spot. Upon entering the shipyard, a worker would be presented with a board, as it was known, which was a small square of wood used to keep track of the hours spent working. A worker's board was to remain on him at all times, only being surrendered during bathroom breaks, of which workers were allotted just 7 minutes per day. An employee called a minuteman was responsible for keeping track of these very important 7 minutes and ensuring that no one took more than their fair share of bathroom time, if you want to call that fair. The board would also be turned over to an employee called a timekeeper at the end of the workday, whose job it was to calculate all the hours worked and the wages owed. Now, this system was not without its flaws. The boards, being small wooden objects made for enjoyable projectiles for the workers to unceremoniously chuck at unsuspecting timekeepers, who would then have the unenviable task of rounding up all the boards that were now strewn about the floor. But what were the conditions in the yard actually like? Workplace safety regulations still had decades before they would be properly implemented, and this period in time was infamous for countless avoidable workplace accidents. Harland & Wolff was sadly no exception. Contrasted with the immaculate, elegant liners they were knocking together rivet by rivet, the workers knew very little of luxury. While building Titanic, 8 men lost their lives, with about 250 more sustaining injuries. The constant hammering and use of loud machinery meant that many riveters were prone to deafness, and the handling of red-hot rivets often lent to burnt or calloused hands. Shipyards were also notorious for their use of asbestos in everything from insulation to a special mitt worn by members of the riveting teams to protect against the heat. Now this, of course, led to extremely high rates of cancer among shipyard workers. One rivet counter, Robert Murphy, tragically lost his life when the 2 wooden planks he was standing on gave way just as he raised his hand to count the rivets before him, and he fell 50 feet to his death as his fellow workers watched helplessly nearby. Now, the danger didn't just extend to the time spent working on the ship either. One of the most infamous and tragic deaths associated with the building of Titanic actually happened not during construction, but on the day of her launch. It was a bright and cheerful day, and Titanic stood proudly on the slipway, finally ready to take to the water for the very first time. As a lively crowd and a number of proud shipbuilders looked on, the timber stays that were used to hold the ship in place were knocked away, and all eyes were on Titanic as she began to slowly slide down the ways. Cheers and applause followed as the vessel hit the water, but obscured from the crowd's view was the tragic and untimely demise of James Dobbin, a shipwright who was horrifically crushed by a falling wooden support as the ship was released from her stays, making him the first official victim of not yard number 401, but the RMS Titanic. To this day, there are a number of researchers that contend that the shipbuilders were at fault for the Titanic disaster. According to this theory, a lack of high-quality steel led Harland & Wolff to use substandard iron rivets in the bow section of the ship, which were much weaker than their tougher steel counterparts. Other theories speculate that the company had settled for unskilled riveters due to a shortage of workers in the skilled trades, but it's simply not true. Despite the raised eyebrows of all the parties blamed for the sinking, no fault was ever found on the part of Harland & Wolff. In fact, all evidence collected shows that the yard designed and constructed the liner to exacting specifications for her owners and the strict standards put into place by the British Board of Trade. For all of the heartbreaking tragedy that befell the ship, she was, at the end of it all, still a well-designed and structurally sound vessel. Tests had been conducted on Titanic's steel, and it was shown to be brittle, which was standard for the time. Advanced knowledge of the chemical composition of metal and alloys was still decades away, and the shipyard did the best with what they had for the time. Had it not been for the unfortunate circumstances that historic night, Titanic may very well have enjoyed as successful a career as her sister Olympic, the pride of her shipbuilders, who went on to delight seafarers for a remarkable 24 years. These vessels were not quickly slapped together and tossed into the sea with fingers crossed. They truly were the best that Edwardian engineering had to offer. Every rivet, frame and plate on Titanic was placed with the utmost care, and it showed through in every square inch of her richly appointed structure. At the end of the day, what made people believe that Titanic was unsinkable was not her lavish appointments or her staggering size, but the solid and sound construction, a testament to the literal blood, sweat and tears poured into the liner by her builders, who were, of course, devastated to hear of the loss of their pride and joy once word had spread of her sinking. While Harland & Wolff did not succeed in building an unsinkable ship, what they did succeed in building was an unsinkable legend, a behemoth whose splendour will continue to transfix the world for generations to come. In the Second World War, German U-boats hunted Allied shipping with ruthless efficiency, claiming thousands of victims and threatening Britain's sea lanes. In fact, Winston Churchill famously went on to say that the one thing that worried him most during the war was the U-boat threat. German submarine captains racked up impressive kill tallies. In fact, if I were to ask you what the most successful submarine of all time was, then you might think it had come from that war, World War II. But, incredibly, you'd actually have to cast the history books back nearly 20 years prior to the First World War, when the SM U-35 somehow defied the odds and overcame technological limitations of the time to become the most deadly undersea hunter of all time. The submarine would go on to sink a devastating amount of Allied shipping, equating to nearly 500,000 gross registered tons. The submarine was, at the start of the First World War, as yet unproven. Many in the British Admiralty considered it to be little more than a toy, but it was the German Imperial Navy that had taken a much more active role in developing the submarine into a fearsome fighting weapon. The German subs, called U-boats, from the German word Unterseeboot, emerged in the early 1900s and were refined with each subsequent class. In 1912, enough lessons had been learnt to begin production of a particularly efficient class of sub called the U-31 class. Now these things were for their day absolutely cutting edge. U-31 and her sisters were fairly long, at around 212 feet or 65 meters, with space inside enough for 35 men. On the surface, the boats were powered by 6-cylinder 2-stroke diesel engines, giving them 3,700 horsepower total. Now back then, diesel technology was really just in its infancy. The engines gave the boats a fairly modest top speed of about 16 knots on the surface. Below the waterline though, the diesels were disengaged and the screws were driven by electric motors. Now this silent setup could drive the sub forward at just over 9 knots. Not fast enough to catch up to or overtake enemy vessels, but fast enough that repositioning could be done for a better attack. The boats were actually designed to operate mainly on the surface, diving only after the enemy had been sighted. At the start of the war, the U-boats operated according to the so-called cruiser rules, intercepting Allied ships, ordering them to surrender, and only then engaging and sinking them. The Germans were dismayed to discover, though, that the British and Allied ships, instead of surrendering, began to attack the surface submarines, with some even veering off to ram and sink them. It changed German doctrine and the way submarines were used forever. Now there would be no warning before the deadly blow was struck. The U-boat's primary weapon was the torpedo, then over 6 meters or 263 inches long, packing a massive 353-pound, 160-kilogram hexanite explosive warhead. Now, they were driven at speed by piston engines, turned with compressed air mixed with kerosene vapor, which would ignite, expanding the air to provide more power and driving a single propeller. Now, the Kaiser's U-boat fleet was very well trained, and they were keen to show what they could do at the outbreak of the war. Unfortunately for the British, one of those submarines would prove to be very, very good at hunting indeed. U-35 was sister boat to the U-31, and from the outside, there was nothing out of the ordinary about her. Her design was not revolutionary. She didn't push the technological boundaries or anything like that, and there was nothing to suggest that this modest U-boat would go on to become the deadliest submarine of all time. Her first skipper was Captain Waldemar Kopphamel, a capable German Navy veteran who led U-35 on her first successful patrols. After initial reconnaissance work, U-35 was let loose to do as much damage as she could, and those early days were highly lucrative for the boat. For the first year or so of the war, she sank no less than 38 ships, nearly all of them British and French transports. Her final kill in this period was a ship of some notoriety. Back in 1912, the liner RMS Titanic had sunk after striking an iceberg, and famously a mystery ship could just be seen off in the near distance which never seemed to respond to distress calls or rockets. That ship was called SS Californian, and her crew were horrified to discover the next morning that Titanic had sunk and that the strange sights they'd seen had actually been the Titanic going under. In late 1915, it was Californian's turn when she had been damaged by a torpedo hit from U-34. Under tow by a French vessel, U-35 struck the final killing blow, and Californian, the unlucky villain of the Titanic story, was sunk. By that point in 1915, the war had been going very well indeed for U-35, but something was about to happen that would blast her kill count into the stratosphere. Captain Cophamel was transferred, and down the conning tower hatch for the first time strode Captain Lothar von Arnaud de la Perriere in his place. De la Perriere was a Prussian aristocrat of French-German ancestry who'd served in battleships, cruisers, and then as an adjutant at the war's outbreak. He then had a quick stint in the Zeppelin service before bizarrely transferring to the U-boat arm, which is about as far away from airships as one can get. And it was here that de la Perriere would find his true calling. In January 1916, U-35 began to take a deadly toll on British and Allied shipping. Working her way through the Mediterranean, U-35 would engage enemy ships according to the old prize rules. De la Perriere himself explained when he said, "We stopped the vessels, the crews boarded the lifeboats, we inspected the ship's documents, told the crews how they could reach the next port, and then sank the stopped prize." It meant that U-35 achieved most of her kills not with torpedoes, but with her single deck gun. Now, most of U-35's victims at this time were cargo ships less than about 5,000 tons, but a few notable exceptions stand out. In February 1916, she encountered and sank the beautiful old French ocean liner La Provence, and then, in October, the troopship and former liner Galore. Galore had been another French liner operated by the same company as La Provence, the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, or CGT. At this time, de la Perriere did not play by the old prize rules. Instead, he torpedoed Galore, but then looked on in horror as ammunition deep in the ship's holds detonated. The ocean liner sank in just 15 minutes with more than 1,000 victims. As the war dragged on, U-35 sank ship after ship after ship. A glimpse inside her logbook reveals dozens and dozens of ships' names. In April 1917 alone, for example, U-35 sank the ships Ardask, Marguerite, Parkgate, Maplewood, Miss Morris, India, Giuseppe Acame, Odysseus, Stromboli, Patagoniae, Penagi, Drakatos, Brisbane River, Corfu, Fernmore, Trekiev, Sowell, Liso Castle, Lowdale, Nentmore, Bandiera e Moro, Bien Prof Luigi, Nordson, Travore, Wilhelm Krag, and Triana. Then, one day, the familiar shape of a four-funneled ocean liner came into view in the boat's crosshairs. De la Perriere gazed through and recognized the mighty ocean liner Olympic, sister ship to Titanic, then serving as a trooper. Fortunately for the ocean liner, conditions were bad enough as to prohibit an attack, and she got away unscathed. U-35's July to August 1916 patrol stands as one of the most successful submarine patrols of all time because the boat sank no fewer than 54 ships for about 90,000 gross registered tons and having only used 4 torpedoes. Now for this, de la Perriere was awarded one of Germany's highest military honours, the Pour le Mérite Medal, also known as the Blue Max. Now by 1918, de la Perriere and his boat had done some devastating damage to the Allies. In fact, under de la Perriere alone, some 193 Allied ships totaling about 453,000 tons of shipping, which is by itself an astounding amount, had been sunk. It made de la Perriere the most successful submarine skipper of all time, a record as yet unchallenged. De la Perriere was replaced by 2 captains who couldn't quite recapture the magic of their forebear, but still, by the end of the war, U-35 had sunk a further 7 ships. In late 1918, she was surrendered to the British, who at last came face to face with the boat that had hunted them for 4 years. U-35 had sent 220 ships to the bottom of the ocean from as many nations as Denmark, Egypt, Greece, France, Japan, Italy, Norway, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Tunisia, and Britain. She had engaged and sunk 3 Royal Navy warships, and the final tally of sunken tonnage came out to 505,121 gross registered tons. It's a record for a single submarine that hasn't been challenged ever since. By contrast, in World War II, the most successful German U-boat, U-48, sank about a quarter of the number of ships U-35 had, and USS Tang, the most successful American submarine, also sank about 1/4 the amount of tonnage that U-35 did. De la Perriere, U-35's most successful commander, was quite flippant about his success. When asked about his record-breaking 1916 patrol, he said simply that it had been, quote, quite tame and dull. U-35 was given no special treatment by her British captors. With the war over, it was mothballed and finally broken up for scrap in 1920. History's most fearsome undersea hunter ended her career at the breaker's yard, turned into razor blades, while today there are 220 shipwrecks still on the ocean floor attributed to this one ferocious submarine. It's April 15th, 1912, about 370 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The night air is cold and calm, the sky is alight with stars, and the ocean is as still as glass. But on it, the world's newest and grandest ocean liner, RMS Titanic, is going down by the head. Witnesses who were standing among the crowds of people filling the boat deck, looking on as families were separated in the chaos, noticed something peculiar as one of the final lifeboats, Collapsible C, began to be loaded. Men were scrambling in a panic for a seat, and among them was none other than J. Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line, finding a place in the lifeboat determined to save his own life rather than going down with his ship as honor would dictate. He successfully escaped, while 1,500 others, including women and children, perished behind him. The headlines the next morning wasted no time alerting the public to the scandalous details of Ismay's escape during the sinking. He was branded a coward, with the press and the public in agreement that as chairman of the White Star Line, Ismay's rightful place was alongside the captain on the bridge, awaiting the ship's final plunge. But then came allegations that Ismay had urged Captain Smith to push for a faster crossing during the maiden voyage, and it earned him a lifetime of scorn and a ruined reputation which lasts to this day. In movie adaptations of the sinking, Ismay is always depicted as a greedy and tactless villain twirling his moustache and making the selfish decision to save himself over others at the very last moment. But as with all things, the reality is a lot more complicated. Born in Crosby, Lancashire in 1862, Ismay was destined for the shipping business from the very start. In the early years of his career, he worked under his father, Thomas Ismay, who at the time was the chair of the White Star Line, one of the premier transatlantic passenger lines. Upon Thomas's death in 1899, Joseph, or Bruce as he was more commonly known, assumed the role of chairman of the line, and his first order of business was to couple his father's last ship, the Celtic, with not just a single sister, but a trio of them comprising what would be known as the Big Four. These ships, Celtic, Cedric, Adriatic, and Baltic, were the largest and most luxurious liners to take to the water at the time, and they were a resounding success for the company. Now, this success would only last for a few years before their competitors Cunard Line responded with their own superliners, the Speed Queens Mauretania and Lusitania. Now, Ismay knew that the White Star Line needed to respond. The transatlantic game at the time was like a never-ending game of one-upsmanship. Legend has it that at a dinner meeting in 1907 with Lord Pirrie, chairman of Harland and Wolff Shipbuilders, the two men devised a plan for a trio of ships that would outclass the Cunard Greyhounds, which would result, of course, in the construction of the Olympic class, beginning with Olympic, the later sister being Britannic, and of course, in the centre of it all, the ill-fated RMS Titanic. Now, it wasn't uncommon for Ismay to travel on his ships during their maiden voyages, and this was the case in April of 1912 as he boarded the Titanic, preparing to make the crossing between Southampton and New York and back again. Now, as we know, this round trip would be cut short by a cruel twist of fate, and it's believed by some that Ismay is far from blameless in the tragic foundering of the liner. Elizabeth Lines, a first-class passenger travelling on Titanic, recalled overhearing a conversation on board the ship between Ismay and Captain Smith, in which the men were discussing the prospect of putting more pressure on the boilers in an attempt to potentially speed up the ship's crossing. The conversation gave rise to the rumour that Ismay coerced Smith into speeding the ship into the ice field, therefore dooming the liner. He was quoted as saying, "Things are working smoothly, the machinery is bearing the test and the boilers are working well. We'll beat Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday." But while many took this to mean the ship would be pushed harder than Olympic's crossing time from the year before, it was likely just an observation. At the time of that conversation, the ship had been steaming along at an impressive clip, and Titanic was on track to beat her sister's crossing time. But it was also not up to Ismay to make decisions as to the ship's operation. Those decisions lay entirely with the ship's master, Smith, and Ismay, while he was the ship's owner, was officially making the crossing as a passenger, not an officer or crew member. It's been said that Ismay, as White Star Line's managing director, could put undue pressure on Captain Smith to make it into New York early. But evidence seems to show that Ismay was one to mostly honour his role as passenger when it came to decision-making and defer judgment to the ship's officers and crew. When Olympic had first entered service and Ismay exchanged a series of communiques with Philip Franklin, the chairman of the White Star Line's parent company, the International Mercantile Marine, Franklin was pushing for Olympic to dock early at New York, the Tuesday night instead of the Wednesday morning. Ismay responded, "As you are aware, I am not favourably disposed to trying to land passengers on Tuesday afternoon, but if after talking the matter over with Lord Pirrie, Captain Smith, and Mr. Bell, the consensus of opinion is in favour of this being done, you may rest assured that I will not allow my individual feeling to stand in the way." Now, this response does not paint the picture of a man keen to rush his ship into harm's way. He mentions specifically that he would first need to get the consent of Captain Smith, Joseph Bell, Olympic's chief engineer, and Lord Pirrie from the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Now, obviously, Ismay could never truly be just an ordinary passenger, but when it came to decision-making on the ship's run, it doesn't seem like Ismay would want to overrule the captain. In fact, far from being one to put pressure on the ship's crew to land early, it seems that Ismay, early on in Olympic's career, was of the exact opposite opinion. Although landing on the Tuesday night would be of benefit to the ship, she could be prepared for the return voyage sooner and easier, and passengers could opt to sleep on board for the night if they wanted, Ismay was clearly still no fan of early landings. On the topic, he said to Franklin, "As I have repeatedly stated, I feel very strongly that passengers would be far more satisfied to know, when they left here, that they would not land until Wednesday morning, rather than be in a state of uncertainty in regard to this for the whole of the trip. I do not think you can have ever experienced the miseries of a night landing in New York. Had you done so, I think your views might be altered." Now, by the time Titanic was steaming on her maiden voyage, the concept of landing on a Tuesday night instead of the Wednesday morning may have become more the norm, so chances are they may have been a little bit more flippant about it aboard Titanic. But as a character study, this does not sound like the kind of moustache-twirling villain who was keen to put pressure on the ship's crew to make an early landing in New York in the first place. Now, further blame was cast on Ismay for his decision to apparently disregard the ice warnings which had been sent by other vessels. Now, as with the ship's speed, it was once again not within Ismay's purview to decide what should be done with ice warnings. While several witnesses describe Ismay flashing a Marconigram with ice warnings from the nearby ship Baltic, one of the big four, and then subsequently downplaying the danger, this was in no way a show of negligence or carelessness. The messages had already been handed off to Ismay by Captain Smith, who had received them and then made note of them in their positions before passing the information along to Ismay. It was entirely common for Ismay and other higher-ups, like Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, to keep tabs on the ship's performance throughout her maiden voyage and assure that everything was functioning as intended. Now, weather reports, like those from Baltic, were also part of this routine. Now, what Smith chose to do once he received these warnings is no real reflection on Ismay, who was merely using the Marconigrams, which were then the absolute latest technology at sea and a marvel in their own right, to make conversation with passengers throughout the voyage. Now, shortly after the collision with the iceberg, Ismay gathered with the ship's officers on the bridge to discuss the extent of the damage. Donned in pajamas, an overcoat, and slippers, he was one of the first people on board to learn of Titanic's impending fate. Now, despite knowing full well that the iceberg had damaged his ship mortally, Ismay reportedly proceeded onto the boat deck as the passengers were mustered, a serene smile on his face, careful not to let his expression betray him in case panic should spread among the passengers. As lifeboats began to be loaded and lowered away, Ismay himself, travelling as an ordinary passenger, spent 2 hours, almost the entirety of the time it took the ship to sink, ushering women and children into the boats and helping the ship's officers maintain order. One woman reportedly approached a boat with Ismay saying, "Come along and jump in," and she replied, "But I'm only a stewardess." Ismay saw her hesitation and responded, "Never mind, you are a woman, take your place." Some other officers recalled that Ismay was so insistent upon helping women into the boats that they felt he was hindering their own efforts, with 5th Officer Harold Lowe at one point exploding at Ismay to stop interfering in his work. Ismay, by this point, was a little more panicked and called for a boat to be lowered away over and over again. Lowe bawled, "If you will get to hell out of it, then I shall be able to do something." Now, from this point onward, Ismay continued to assist passengers, but also stayed out of the way of the other officers. It wouldn't be until the third to last boat was being lowered that Ismay considered escaping the ship himself. Now, the Senate hearings held after the sinking placed Ismay in one of the final lifeboats to leave the ship, Collapsible C, only after he and another male first-class passenger, Mr. William Carter, repeatedly called out to assure that no other women and children were around to take their seats in the boat. Now, popular media would go on to relentlessly lambast Ismay for his decision to board a lifeboat in lieu of women and children, despite the fact that he had spent the ship's final hours helping to save as many lives as he could. Ismay, it seems, was adhering to the policy of women and children first, rather than women and children only. In maritime disasters, the policy was for the women and children to proceed into the lifeboats first, and men would only be permitted aboard once there was room. Now, as both Ismay and Carter made sure no more were waiting to board, protocol dictated that they could freely board the boat themselves. With no women and children in sight to take Ismay's place in the lifeboat, no further lives were lost as a result of his decision to save himself. Perhaps to underline this, Collapsible Sea's total occupancy upon leaving Titanic was 44 passengers, while its ultimate capacity was 47. Now, this lends credence to his testimony that no further passengers were waiting to be helped into the boat as he made the decision to enter it, because the boat was never completely filled. Testimonies also state that just prior to Ismay climbing into the boat, there was a large group of men scrambling for a spot. To quell the chaos, it said that an officer, reportedly First Officer Murdoch, fired 2 warning shots into the air, bringing the crowd to order. The gunshots would have been enough to frighten much of the crowd away, sending many in search of other means of escape. With no one standing around, and enough room for several passengers still available on Collapsible Sea, Ismay and Carter stepped into the boat as it began to lower away. For Ismay, this would prove something of a miscalculation, to say the least. Edwardian culture focused on the concept of the ideal man, one who would sacrifice himself gladly for king and country. It was the kind of ridiculous, nationalistic chest-thumping that would lead in just 2 short years to the horrendous casualties and battlefield losses of the First World War. Even children were being indoctrinated with this stuff. In Peter Pan, published just 1 year before Titanic sank, the titular character is confronted with his impending fate, and, unable to escape, simply stands up proudly to declare, "To die will be an awfully big adventure." In the same book, Wendy confronts the pirate Hook, who says, "So, my beauty, you are to see your children walk the plank. Are they to die?" asked Wendy. "They are," he snarled. At this moment, Wendy was grand. "These are my last words, dear boys," she said firmly. "I feel that I have a message to you from your real mothers, and it is this. We hope our sons will die like English gentlemen." This was a best-selling children's novel. Now, it was this kind of rigid, ideological society that Bruce Ismay would soon face, and as Titanic sank, the lights cut out and the ship was finally plunged into darkness, Ismay sat facing away. He couldn't bring himself to watch. Once rescue arrived, conflicting accounts of Ismay's actions once again served to muddy his reputation. Some witnesses later claimed that upon boarding Carpathia, Ismay immediately set about loudly and boisterously claiming, I'm Ismay, for God's sake, get me something to eat. I'm starved. I don't care what it costs or what it is, bring it to me." Another variation alleges that he was shouting to be immediately shown to a stateroom, then reportedly sequestered himself the stateroom of the ship's doctor, refusing to speak to anyone in order to hide from the scrutiny of passengers. But Ismay's official testimony, as well as the testimony of others on board, directly contradict this story. Riddled with trauma and having just endured a night floating in a rickety lifeboat with no food or water in the freezing North Atlantic, it isn't likely that Ismay would have been a man with enough vigour to be loudly making demands. By all accounts, Ismay was a shattered husk of the man he'd been the day before. After he came on board, Ismay is reported to have been standing with his back against a bulkhead, refusing all offers of food and water, only quietly requesting after some time that he be shown to a room where he could be alone. He was shaking like a leaf. While in his room, he spent the rest of the journey to New York in a heavily medicated daze, grief-stricken over the loss of Titanic and the souls who went down with her. Second Officer Lightoller and first-class passenger Jack Thayer both visited him in his stateroom on Carpathia, where they recall a deeply shaken Ismay repeating again and again that he should have gone down with his ship, and they didn't realise so many women had perished. Ismay believed that he had left behind an empty ship, and the survivor's guilt had left him in a nearly catatonic state for the remainder of the journey to New York. Interestingly, before reaching New York, a few Marconigrams were sent out from Carpathia to White Star's New York office under a clever codename, signed Yamsey, which was Ismay spelt backwards. He first sent news of the sinking, and then a few hours later, another telegram was sent requesting that White Star's vessel Cedric, another one of the Big Four, be made ready immediately for a journey back home to Britain for himself and Titanic's surviving officers. Now, Ismay's critics point to these telegrams as evidence that Ismay was attempting to flee from the Senate inquiries that he knew would come to pass, realizing full well that he would be in danger of being held liable for the sinking. The White Star Line, Titanic's owner, was itself owned by an American conglomerate, the International Mercantile Marine. But Ismay's own testimony contradicts this as well. He claims that he was unaware that the hearings would be held in the US. He had assumed that because Titanic flew the British flag, the inquiries would be held on British soil. So it seems likely that Ismay was actually trying to make him and his officers ready for an inquiry at the first possible notice. Officer Lightoller testified he'd even offered the suggestion to Ismay himself, as he was under the same impression. Now, both men insisted that the telegrams were Ismay's attempt to ensure he'd be present for the proceedings, rather than planning to run away from them entirely. Of course, public opinion of Ismay plummeted after the sinking, with newspaper headlines branding him a coward, and rumours spreading that he'd even dressed in women's clothing to disguise himself and be allowed entry into a lifeboat. Yellow journalism was firing on all cylinders, with one man in particular, the powerful American journalist William Randolph Hearst, dubbing him J. Brute Ismay, and publishing scathing political cartoons in an attempt to smear Ismay's name. Hearst was no Ismay fan to begin with. The two had already formed an intense dislike of one another after years of disagreements. The defamation in the American press left little for Ismay in the way of recourse. There would be very little pity from the public for a powerful and wealthy businessman who reportedly chose to save his own skin rather than die honourably. Other journalists were gentler with their assessment, but the undertone still remained, with one journal simply remarking, "It is not given to everybody to be a hero." Ismay was also widely blamed for the lack of lifeboats available on Titanic. Critics were quick to point out that the lack of lifeboats must have been a cost-cutting measure on Ismay's part in order to make the ship more profitable, which is a ridiculous myth that still exists to this day. But Titanic, like all other ships of her time, was built to specifications required by the British Board of Trade, and Titanic's designers had actually exceeded this expectation by providing more lifeboats than was necessary. And once the Senate inquiry into the sinking was concluded, Ismay was cleared of all liability relating to the sinking. Senator Smith, who oversaw the proceedings, determined that Ismay had done everything in his power to save as many lives as possible in the 2 hours he spent on deck, and that in not choosing to save himself, he would have added just one more life to the 1,500 already lost. Despite having been legally cleared of any wrongdoing, Ismay would never recover from the public scorn and the trauma of having lost Titanic. He quietly resigned from most of the companies he oversaw, but he stayed on as chairman of the White Star Line to oversee a grim task. He stayed on to help pay out insurance claims filed by victims of the disaster. It's said that there wasn't a single following board meeting where Ismay did not bring up on the agenda the payment of claims to victims' families. He became a recluse and absolutely retreated from public view until his death in 1937. It's said that Titanic became a taboo subject among his family, and no one was able to mention it. 1 year before his death, his granddaughter Evelyn naively asked if he'd ever been involved in a shipwreck. In possibly the first and last occasion of Ismay ever speaking of Titanic after the sinking, he simply replied, "Yes, I was once on a ship that was thought to be unsinkable." With all the drama surrounding the Titanic disaster and the 1,500 lives lost, the public was clamouring to find a scapegoat, and Ismay fit the bill perfectly. He had all the makings of the picture-perfect villain, a businessman who inherited a business from his father, immense wealth, and a decision to save his own life over those of women and children. But so much of this narrative was by design, essentially propaganda, by an American press controlled by anti-British management that had everything they needed to construct the perfect villain in the form of J. Bruce Ismay. The portrayal stuck. Almost every depiction of Ismay in Titanic-related media like movies and films since the sinking has depicted him as the nefarious businessman risking lives to turn a profit. Those responsible for this journalism, quote-unquote, most notably William Randolph Hearst, were not out to expose the truth. They just had been handed the story of a lifetime, and Ismay was caught in the crossfire. To this very day, we see the effects of the Ismay smear campaign, and his name has become associated with spinelessness and greed in the face of the world's most famous maritime disaster. But only by challenging this narrative and actually studying the facts do we come to appreciate the complexity of Ismay's position. Many argue that Bruce Ismay was a man who died twice, officially in 1937, but perhaps in a more significant and painful way on the morning of April 15th, 1912. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.